My guest today is filmmaker Michael Husain and his powerful documentary, The Waiting Game, that reveals an incredible battle between the NBA and a tiny nonprofit working to gain full recognition for the men of the ABA, a colorful, exciting rival league that arguably invented the modern game of basketball. It's a fight for benefits the players of the ABA felt were promised but never delivered. Now, Michael is also known for directing the 2024 documentary short, The Sugar Man. He is the founder of Good Vibes Media and winner of multiple National Sports Emmy Awards for his documentary work. Now, Michael has created over 200 hours of documentary and nonfiction television, including the ESPN 30 for 30 short, Slick, Nancy, and the Telethon. Also, multiple episodes of A&E's American Justice and biography series, as well as disaster, medical, and lifestyle programming for Discovery Networks, along with the work for the History Channel, VH1, HGTV, just to name a few. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome filmmaker Michael Husain and his new film documentary, again, the compelling The Waiting Game, to the show. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be here.
Well, how did you come to learn about this situation between the ABA, which is the American Basketball Association, and the NBA to create a film documentary about it?
I knew what the ABA was, that there had been this renegade rival league, but I met a guy randomly who was a lawyer and was telling me the story that he'd been working on this, not quite a settlement, but he'd been working with the NBA to try and get ABA players who had been really, really struggling. And he described really bad situations where, people were homeless, people could not afford their life-saving medicines, etc. Things that you'd really worry about when you're an older person, certainly. And he's describing these ABA players, which you can imagine if you're not familiar with the ABA, NBA players, your top athletes in the world, elite people who are struggling at this level. It seemed impossible to me. And he said, no, that's what happened. There was a bad business deal that combined the two leagues, but he thought he was close. He said, we've been talking with them for nearly 2 years, and I think we're going to get a settlement in the next 6 weeks or so. And so I said, it's fascinating. I thought it was a short. I thought, I asked him, could we film for those 6 weeks? You're never going to be able to recreate the moment when you get that win, and then we can go tell the backstory of the ABA. He agreed, and so we really only filmed 2 or 3 times before I met him in December of 2021, and filming, thinking that he was going to go to the All-Star game in February of 2022 with a big announcement. It's going to be, half court of where the All-Star game was being played. And February came, February went, nothing happened. He calls the NBA and says, what's going on? He says, it's just a slight delay with little dotted I over here, a little cross T over there. Could be just a couple of weeks. Time just kept moving on. And so very quickly, the frustration started to build in this guy who I had really just met, but I was impressed with his earnestness and his drive. He wasn't getting anything for this. He was working completely pro bono with a little not-for-profit that you mentioned in the intro called the Dropping Dimes Foundation, which in basketball parlance is an assist. And so he and an eye surgeon here in the town where I live in Indianapolis, the guy named John Abrams, were working on this, and so the more time that went on, what wound up happening was a tragedy. Was happening right in front of our eyes. Guys started dying. Guys were really struggling with some of the things that I mentioned earlier, and he started to get really, really angry. He went from a lawyer who is very sort of buttoned down and tries not to let his emotions come through. I could see him getting frustrated, and So this turned quickly from a short to this is a feature. Like this is something that's less about sports and more about human and economic justice. And so it's got sports clothing, no doubt, because the ABA was a really impactful, important league in terms of modern professional sports. But the story is much more human than you might imagine.
That's the thing about sports. There's always a human connection, if it's the players or the fans, but sports brings emotion. I mean, the ABA, to me, I still remember the day because that's when we had real basketball. We had real defense, driving through the lane and slam dunks, not this three-pointer contest that every game has in the NBA with a bunch of overpriced floppers, which is one reason why I kind of gave up on the NBA because I just got tired of no defense because they don't
Mhm.
play defense today. So that, the NBA kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. And after watching this film, I'm really not a fan of the NBA, but it was the ABA, and this is the thing I loved about your documentary, The Waiting Game. There is an incredible history that you bring forth about the ABA. They were the ones that deserve all the credit for setting up the success of the NBA because it was the ABA, as you know, created all of the elements that we see today. I mean, there's the All-Star game, there's shooting contest, and you really showed that the NBA isn't really original at all.
It took a lot of the elements. So let's go back to the beginning of the ABA. The ABA began in 1967 as this rival league to the NBA, largely because the NBA wasn't letting in many teams, and so uh, the owners who started ABA franchises really were trying to sort of force their way into the NBA, and they had to come up with something that was different. So they played, first of all, the most obvious difference. They played with a red, white, and blue basketball, and then they allowed a 3-point shot, which is foundational, right, to what the NBA is today. So Steph Curry owes a lot, for instance, to the ABA. The ABA had a slam dunk contest at their All Star game. And probably the most discernible impact that you can look at beyond those rule based sort of things is they needed players, and they really didn't care where the players came from. They needed the best, most entertaining players. They knew they needed an entertaining product, right? The NBA was sort of staid and kind of boring. Was pass slowly. There were still set shots in the NBA at this point, and so the ABA brought an amplification of everything that we see in the modern NBA. So they got a lot of black players, guys who played at historically black colleges, uh, and just didn't have the opportunities in the NBA. Now the NBA was integrated, but not very much. There were unwritten quotas about how many blacks could play at any given time, and so and you take all this in the context of the 60s, right? So the civil rights movement is well underway in 1967. So opportunities for black players was an enormously progressive kind of thing, and and because the fear was that, well, it's the white audiences that are paying to come to our games, they're not going to see themselves in on these players on the court. But what happened, of course, is that nobody cared. Like, people loved a great entertainment product, and that was the probably the primary difference is they made an entertainment product, not a sports product. And so they brought in halftime shows. There was a live bear that wrestled at a halftime of an Indiana Pacers game during the ABA. All sorts of kind of nutty things that maybe you would associate with the best of minor league baseball. Like, they weren't afraid to try things, and so, but they were always short on money. The NBA always had more money, and they had television contracts, even though at that point television contracts were relatively small, have one, a national one anyway. And so that, over the course of time, really hurt them. And so the two leagues needed to combine, and it led to what is often called the merger in 1976. And so when the two leagues combined, the ABA, four teams came into the NBA that are still there: the Pacers, the Nuggets, the Spurs, and the Nets. But the players themselves who didn't get pulled into the NBA, and again, not that many opportunities. So there were a lot of guys who really were out of a job, and so the deal was a tough one. It was one where we wound up, because of the lawyer that I mentioned in my first answer. He wound up going back into all the documentation of what happened in 1976 to find out why these guys were in the position they were as old men. Why didn't they have retirement benefits? Why wasn't there health care? Why wasn't there a pension? And because when you talk to the ABA players, they all thought it was in the deal from 1976. They can cite you, chapter and verse. It says in there, we will have the same retirement benefits as an NBA team or an NBA player. And it had never materialized. In fact, guys had called when they turned 50 or 55 or 60. They'd call the NBA offices and say, okay, how do I get my pension started? And the NBA would say, you don't have one. And so there was this enormous disconnect. And so the lawyer, Scott Tarter, the co-founder of the Dropping Dimes Foundation, went back in and it's his investigation back into those documents is core to our story. And so we try and find out why these guys don't have a pension benefit, and then what could be done, even if the legal documentation wound up being correct, that they don't have one. From a human point of view, how could you not provide these guys who created so much of the wealth of the NBA, right? So the NBA is a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut, and it has, it flies not only on the on-court game, but it flies on cultural influence, sneaker culture, entertainment culture, black culture. All of that stuff came out of the ABA, not the NBA's own history. So a legal deal got them the ABA influence, and they took it and ran with it. It's wonderful. It's great business. And they've done very, very well for themselves. But to not recognize the pioneers and the legends who started that and offer them the most basic of human decency from an economic point of view, it was hard for me to understand, and I think it's hard for the audience to understand that sees the film.
Yeah, but see, the thing is and you keep replaying this in the film, and every time the wording within that merger came up, if I read it at face value, like the ABA players did, I would have thought that I was entitled to a pension. But the wording did so for the players as they read it, they all agreed what it said. The NBA looked at it was, no, that's not what that actually says. We're not responsible. The ABA is. But the ABA doesn't exist. So who's taking the responsibility? So the NBA, again, is, like you said, it's a juggernaut. And you show this diagram within this film. They're worth over $120 billion. And you couldn't fork over $35 million for the players that are still alive from the ABA. And even when they finally came into some type of settlement, the settlement still wasn't fair, because you bring forth an ABA player who said, I played in this league for 6 years and I got nothing. Like what I did for 6 years didn't even meet the requirement to get a simple monthly cost of living pension. And I'm like, they still have work to do.
Yes, the film tells what could be a very happy ending. Right, there is progress made, but it's, again, as you said, it's sort of very limited. It's the most. It just left some things out that don't make any sense, and that, to some people, appear cheap, right? And it's like, if anybody shouldn't be cheap, it's an organization worth what the NBA is worth.
Well, you know
Um,
what? There's something else about this because let's use Major League Baseball as an example.
mhm,
Major League Baseball loves going into the past and bringing out things. I mean, look, every year we have that one game where everybody's wearing Jackie Robinson's number. Okay. I think that's awesome. I love the
mhm,
fact that for a year or two, they went to the Field of Dreams to play an outdoor baseball
yes,
game in a cornfield. Everybody loves this stuff. Last season, what did they bring forth? They honored the Negro Baseball League and all of the people that may still be alive, to honor them for what their contribution was to baseball. The NBA has lost their marbles on this because you talk about, for them, look, if their only focus is money, could you imagine how much money there is to bring out the ABA, to bring out the players that started this? They were the personalities. Dr. J, of all people. I mean, when I was a kid, the most famous basketball player on the court was Dr. J. And if it wasn't Dr. J, there was Wilt Chamberlain. But it was Dr. J. I mean, I remember even when he retired, nobody talked about. I mean, if you talked about the most famous player in basketball, it was always Dr. J until the day Michael Jordan showed up, and then it all
yeah,
changed. Because
yeah.
now it's like Jordan, and I get it. I mean, Michael's the man, but before Michael, there was Dr. J. He was the GOAT at that time. And you sit down in front of Dr. J, he even acted like his days in the ABA didn't count, according to the NBA.
Well, that is true, in terms of the way the settlement worked out, or they were called recognition payments. That's what the settlement was sort of termed. But the recognition only applied to guys who played in the ABA, but never in the NBA for 3+ years. So at 3+ years in the NBA, you qualify for the minimum NBA pension. And so for guys like Dr. J, who played 5 years in the ABA, 11 years in the NBA, 16-year career, and as he says in the film, that those 5 years feel like they don't matter in these terms. The statistics don't matter, and there is no recognition of the work put in terms of retirement benefits. And so it's and for a guy like Julius, who's done really really well for himself, he's had a wonderful life. Um, so it's about respect. But there are guys like Jimmy Jones, who was a 6-time ABA All Star, played 3 years in the NBA, so he did qualify for that minimum pension. But he's driving an Uber in Las Vegas. He's not, had such a blessed post career, economically, and so, for a guy like that, not having those 6 or 7 years that he spent in the ABA recognized in any kind of financial way, that's really hard. And he's a legend. He's sort of Hall of Fame, borderline Hall of Fame worthy. So it's guys like that, a guy like Ralph Simpson, who is actually on the Hall of Fame ballot this year. He, in terms of, it's like in the Oscar list, he's shortlisted. So we'll get to the lower list. But he's a fantastic guy and a fantastic player. But he couldn't pay for his heart surgery. He had a very serious, potentially terminal, if you don't take care of it, kind of heart issue, and he was kind of afraid to do it because it was going to cost too much. That's not a position that anyone should be in, let alone someone who played such a central figure in a now mammoth business.
Yeah, so you had the opportunity to interview Dr. J because he was in the ABA as well as the NBA. You also brought in other former players who were willing to talk that were in the ABA. Was there any was it difficult to get anyone from the NBA? Of course you talked to Cliff McCollum
Yeah, CJ.
and
Yeah.
yeah, CJ McCollum. And but was there any pushback from the NBA because you were doing this documentary?
There wasn't really. It was. It's a good question, and so we interviewed CJ after the settlement had happened, and so there was, something of a positive story seemingly unfolding. And CJ was central. CJ is the head of the players union for the NBA right now, and he's very interesting. I thought he was a very interesting interview because he's a very fine NBA player. He's also just a really smart and thoughtful person, and so what he said is like, look, we the players didn't really know this was happening, and um, another key thread of the documentary is the power of journalism. And so there is a reporter who works for the Indianapolis Star who started following Dropping Dimes very early on. So the Dropping Dimes Foundation was started 2015, 2014, something like that. And it was really one of the first things they did. I think they had a few $1,000s in their not for profit. It wasn't big at all. There was a former Pacers player who reached out, and he was struggling, and he just wanted a suit to go to church. That was all he wanted, to be able to dress properly to go to church, and he couldn't afford it. And so um, uh, Dropping Dimes helped him get fitted for a couple of suits. And so she started following their story from that. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so her stories, um, the Indianapolis Star is a part of the Gannett Network. And so several of her stories over the course of years were picked up by the USA Today. So they became national in nature. And her stories really, really broke through, um, to the point where the last one that she did um, basically created enough angry people in the world of social media, whether it was Twitter, or Reddit, or wherever, um, that it came across CJ McCollum's Twitter feed, and people asking, why aren't you helping these guys? Like, they're really struggling, and you have much more than generational wealth. And he noticed it, right? And so I think it's a story on a large scale as much about uh, uh, how we get our information or don't, right? Because for guys in the NBA, and probably now as the WNBA grows, that world too, these athletes have a bubble around them, and I understand it. Lots of people coming and asking for them. As soon as you say I'm an NBA player, people are going to come to you looking for their own opportunity. And so you have walls and walls of protection. So the story by the reporter Dana Benbow broke through, and CJ sees it, and it hits his humanity, which has always been there. It just never got the message. And so um, really something that had been taking close to 2 years now. As soon as CJ found out about it, he made calls. He got some things done. It was a matter of weeks before the approval for this $24 million pot of helpful money for guys who were former ABA players. But the same is sort of true in so there's the players, and then there's the league offices, right? And so the league offices is who had been sort of really taking. Nobody quite knows why. So long to get this done, and the league did provide someone from the office of, it's called NBA Cares. It's their social responsibility wing, and she just explained it as something that they were trying to be very detailed about. They were trying to make sure that they had all the numbers added up, and for some reason that took years. So we appreciated the ability to go to New York and talk with them and hear that side of it. There was really just a disconnect between the urgency that we experienced when I first met Scott Tarter and guys started getting sick and dying, and the very urgent need for these men and their families who had played in the ABA, and the league office, which was just taking the time that it felt it needed, but not necessarily recognizing the urgency.
Yeah, the thing is when I was watching, and I guess it's the woman that was in the documentary, as she was talking, I was thinking the whole time, you're making a simple situation complicated. And that angered me. That angered me even more because she was bringing up an excuse of, if we were to give so much amount of money to these ABA players as a so-called pension, she came out as of what would the repercussions be on other people wanting and driving up the price. And I'm like, that doesn't exist here. You're making this up. That's an excuse. There's only so many men that are still alive. It's not complicated. Get the job done. And I mean, this took way longer than it should have, but it also shows something too that you prove in this documentary. Today's social media plays a big role in the area of public opinion. I mean, when something hits everybody, we become jury, and we can become executioner. Mm-hmm. and judge. But because I've seen this not only with the NBA, the NFL, the MLB, celebrities, everybody getting dogged about the amount of money they make. But when you compare the amount of money of the NBA, my gosh, they could have done way better than 24 million.
Well, I mean, I think, one fact that we wound up not putting in the film, but, within, if I were to, I think it's 22, or maybe 2023, the fine pool alone. So, players talk badly about the refs or whatever, they get fined 25,000 here, 50,000 over there. That pool is like $200 million a year.
Are you kidding me?
No. And the half of that is supposed to be earmarked for charitable contributions. Like, okay, we're going to take this extra money that we have and we're going to give it to very good causes, which is wonderful. The NBA does a tremendous amount of charitable work. It really does. But why wouldn't you take care of your own legends within that? Like, that there were easy, as to your point, there were easier ways to do it. Instead of worrying about whether it was a pension or not or anything like that, they could actually have earmarked a much larger check to the Dropping Dimes Foundation or a different not-for-profit and just said, administer this, right? Just take this charitable contribution and make sure these guys get taken care of. It would have been easy. You wouldn't have had any legal, worry about that. You just made a charitable contribution.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, to me, I would have looked at it like, if I was the head of the NBA, because I believe that history matters. Mm-hmm. I would have looked at it as, okay, $5,000 a month. and full blown gold star healthcare. Because you're talking about guys that are 60, 70, 80 years old. You can't, it's not going to be, look, overall, it's not going to be a long term deal. You're thinking that, I mean, sure, these guys could live to be 90, 95, but that's okay because the whole deal's going to end in 40 years anyway. So
I, yeah.
it's not going to
If even
cost you. But like you said, and this film focuses on the most important thing of all things, human dignity. And that's why I loved this film. It is one of the best documentaries because I love watching documentaries because I love to learn. I love to hear the stories. I want to know the backstory. I want to know how things came to be. And I mean, right now, the NBA is missing the grandest opportunity to be marketing the past of the ABA for their own benefit, but it can also benefit those players that are still around today. I mean, my first basketball was red, white, and blue.
there you go.
I remember, I mean, I had Converse. That was the basketball shoe of the day. You know, Nike wasn't even around back then.
Yeah, well, I
So,
mean, I think that's the thing that it's a serious story. It has a lot of human um, uh, elements that are very very important to sort of who we are as people and as sports fans. But not to be forgotten was just how amazingly fun the ABA was. Right, it was Bob Costas, who's in the film, started his career largely calling Spirits of St. Louis games. He was a fresh out of college kid, and the stories are fantastic about the things that the players used to do, and it was in some ways almost like a hockey league on a basketball court. There were a lot of fights, and there were but then guys would go drinking afterwards, and it was just, it was fans would go drink with the players. Bob Nedelicki, who's in the film, had a bar. He played for the Pacers for many years in Indianapolis, and he had a bar, and everybody would just go to Neto's bar and drink afterwards. So, um,
but what was
they were
funny,
very,
Michael? Yeah, but what was
huh?
funny, Michael, was when I was watching that early history of the ABA. Every player had their own personality. If they wanted an afro 10 feet tall, hey, that was cool. Everybody had fashion. They were setting this whole tone that the NBA emulates today. But what was so funny to me was it reminded me of Will Ferrell's movie Semi Pro because there were aspects of that whole movie. That whole movie was technically ABA. You had wrestling the bear at halftime, and there was no money. These guys were playing with passion and a heart. So when I saw your documentary, I went immediately back and I said, "Oh my gosh, this reminds me of Semi Pro the movie because the elements were identical."
well, we thought about whether or not we should try and license something from Semi Pro just as a cultural reference. We ultimately decided against it, but yeah, that film is hilarious, and yeah, there those threads are there. If you've seen that film and you see the waiting game, you're going to see it. No way to miss it.
Well, what should viewers expect when they watch this film? Because again, Michael, I loved it.
Thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to hear that. When you make a film, you never quite know whether it's going to connect, and I've been thrilled that it has thus far connected with people in a very deep way. I think what I hope happens for people who watch it is that there's a celebration of the ABA first of all, and the players, right? So these guys were fun, and they were incredibly impactful into. Now, I'm not quite to the place where you are with the NBA. I still really love the NBA product in large sense, and so certainly by playoff time I do, and so it's so much impact on the game itself and all the surroundings like we've talked about, and player fashion is fun to watch. Sneaker culture is fun to watch. My kids all love hoop shoes. So it's something that we can really lean into. So learning the history behind where all that came from and appreciating it, that's one part. And then the second part is this human justice, economic justice piece that happens in corporate America, because the game at some level becomes a business, and the business of, well, any business, right? They're it's not just the NBA and this ABA sort of pension idea. That's happened in the auto industry and lots of other places, where the essentially the line factory workers, the blue collar workers who make the value for the company, and then the company gets sold. How much are they considered in the boardroom? How much do we try and make sure that we take care of them in the business deals that unites large companies? Often it's overlooked, and it's something that has repeated itself, and I hope stops repeating itself. And there, there's an interesting awakening for the lawyer Scott Tarter as he goes through this. He is what's called a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, M&A. So that's really helping businesses combine of lawyer, to take on this pro bono work. And so he's been making those deals his entire life, and he has to now reckon with this idea that these guys that he's come to know, he's become best friends with one of the couple of the ABA players, and these guys kind of feeling like they're getting screwed, and realizing that, well, it's these boardroom deals that are happening that at some level, but like the humanity drops out of the room. It's about this number and this risk tolerance and these things that you hear, in those sorts of deals, but very little about, like, wait a minute, like, what if there's a father or a grandfather that needs something in here? Like, those things obviously matter very, very much, but they don't get discussed, at least not enough. So if the humanity could come into the boardroom just a little bit more, out of a story like this, for whatever the industry, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm thinking about what the NFL does, what MLB does, NASCAR does it. The NBA is missing this golden opportunity to
Absolutely not.
create an ABA weekend. I mean, you know how much money they would make on throwback jerseys,
Of course.
and that alone would feed this other pot for the former ABA players,
Yes.
because the NBA needs to embrace that history, need to embrace the players. I mean, we've all been to games where, they honor
Mhm.
a legend, or maybe they have their own local. I'm sure the Cubs, I know the Astros, they got their own, personal Hall of Fame, and we have those Hall of Fame weekends, and the
Yeah.
NBA is missing this. You know how many kids would just would desire a red and white basketball with an
Yeah.
ABA logo on it? They want that sitting right next to their NBA basketball in their room.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a reason at the All-Star game, like the 3-point contest, the money ball, the one that's worth the most in points, it's a red, white, and blue ball. That's the only tribute I can think that the NBA has to the ABA, right now. And you're right. This history is rich, and these, what it would be just as important, I think, to these guys beyond the money, right? So there's
Yeah.
guys who could use some money, is the respect,
The
right? So
respect and the
right now
honor.
there's a sense that we have to ask for your respect as opposed to it being showered upon them. Like it's they're very, very deserving, and it make the latter years of your life, if you think about what was my life's work, right? So at least part of it for these guys was being a professional athlete, professional basketball player. um, what would it be like to be recognized for that, publicly, and celebrated
Well,
for
yeah, I
these
mean,
guys?
I'm thinking, my mind goes into the whole marketing side of things. And
Hmm.
all other sports shower their legends with great praise and honor and Hall of Fames, and the same thing needs to be done with all of these players of ABA. I mean, seriously, everybody, those that are like Lakers fans, they would want, even though the
Yeah.
Lakers weren't part of the ABA, but to having an ABA throwback jersey and some kids wanting LeBron's name on the back,
Hmm.
they'd be forking out the $150 for that. And
Yeah,
same goes with all of the teams. And like you said, the original team, the Pacers, the Nuggets, the Spurs, the Nets. Oh my gosh, the Nets. They're missing their own and here's the thing, Michael. Those teams alone, they're the ones that can lead the whole charge on their own.
yeah, yeah. And a lot of them, they really do, remember their ABA teams very fondly. Like I can speak, I'm from Indianapolis. The culture around Indiana basketball, the Pacers, the ABA Pacers are beloved. And so I know that's true also in Denver. Denver really loves its ABA history and roots. San Antonio, same way. So I think you're right, and there were so many ABA cities that now have NBA franchises. So like in Memphis, right, or the sort of the DC area, there were several teams. ABA teams tended to pop up and then leave quickly because they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have the staying power. But there was an ABA team in Baltimore, in DC briefly, in Virginia. So they were there. Miami had the Floridians. There were teams all over the place, and the gear and all the fun and legendary stories. And honestly, Floridians, they had the cheerleaders that were in bikinis come into their games to distract the other players. I wouldn't be surprised if those cheerleaders are still around. It also could be celebrated for just bringing some fun to the game.
Well, yeah, I'm a baseball fan, and even with the Astros, I have a Colt 45 baseball cap. So I love all the days before what we know now as modern sports, and basketball is no different. And
Yes.
but ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you this. The Waiting Game, this is a very powerful film documentary that gives a history of the ABA, the American Basketball Association, and how it pioneered what we know as the NBA today. But a merger of the two organizations left the players of the ABA without a pension, while the NBA is known to have one of the best pensions in all of sports. The Waiting Game also follows the investigation of the legal trail of the ABA NBA merger, key impact journalism, and the advocacy for justice. The film reveals the lines that can stand between raw corporate interest and, again, basic human dignity. After watching this film, there seems more that needs to be done, so we'll see. And Michael, I want to thank you so much for sharing your amazing film documentary with me today. But what's next for you?
We've got to get this thing distributed. So that's a big part of, as you know, as any filmmaker will tell you, right? So you've got to get out there and make sure people see this story. And people can do that via the website of the film, which is thewaitinggamemovie.com. And then we're actively talking to streamers and the sort of usual suspects there. But next for me is possibly something away from sports a little bit. You mentioned the Sugar Man, which is a story of an Olympic boxer who went blind, and then this I've loved doing a couple of sports films. I'm looking at a story about how we revamp our incarceration system from the inside out, uh, and allowing people with that lived experience to come back in and work as peers and guide and mentors for often people they used to use with in terms of addiction, which is addiction drive and mental health issues drive probably 80% of the incarcerated population in America. And so these people, they're once they have completed their sentence and are trained on how to become essentially a bit of a coach, and can help people they used to use with, like walk out the door. They literally walk out the door with them. Um, so one of the most dangerous times for somebody getting out of prison is the first 24 hours and even the first 24 minutes after you're released, because who's going to be the first number in your phone? It's going to be your dealer. And or sometimes you don't have a place to go because the home that you lived in, your family also used. Both very obviously very bad situations to go back to. So, but if your peer walks along with you and can get you wherever you need to go, and if you can sort of stay out of trouble for that first 24, 36, 72 hours, the odds of you being successful in your reentry are enormous. And there's a program that is working on this that has shown in its pilot about a 25 to 30% reduction in recidivism. Like, that's a huge number of people when you start to multiply it out across the amount of people incarcerated in this country. And so it's a huge amount of human potential. Families that get back together, kids that aren't raised by single parents, or you, the circles start to get very broad very quickly if you can get to that kind of number. So that's what I'm looking at.
Well, you're gonna have to come back when when you get that film done. That's one I would love to talk about.
Be my pleasure.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you need to head over to thewaitinggamemovie.com. This film is coming to a streamer or channel near you, and ESPN, if you're listening, pick this film up because this is right up your alley. And ladies and gentlemen, hey, I know that everybody who watches is an incredible sports fan of whatever your favorite sport is, but this is a film to watch because it is full of, well, history, education, and it shows how all of us need to be, well, better human beings. And in the end, hey, when we love one another, everybody's taken care of. And that's what this film tries to do. Take care of those that haven't been able to take care of themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for watching. And as for me, you'll either see me at the movies or from the red carpet.